Imagine a moment in history when an entire civilization faces destruction by fire and brimstone, where God's wrath rains down from heaven as a response to the overwhelming wickedness and corruption. And in the midst of this, two daughters, left with no other options and facing an uncertain future, make an unthinkable choice. They decide to intoxicate their own father to ensure that their family lineage would survive. One by one, they execute their plan. First, the older daughter approaches him, then the younger follows. From this desperate and controversial act would be born two nations that would change the course of biblical history: the Moabites and the Ammonites. The story we're about to unravel today isn't just another ancient account. It's a narrative filled with complexity, raw emotion, and deep lessons that echo through the generations. These nations, particularly the Moabites, would later become one of Israel's most formidable adversaries, challenging the faith and obedience of God's chosen people. But how could a people born out of such a desperate act rise to such prominence, even to the point of being linked to the lineage of Jesus Christ himself? To understand this, we need to go back to where it all began: the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. As we trace the steps of Lot and his family fleeing from the fiery judgment that consumed those cities, we find ourselves drawn into a story of survival, desperation, and a moment of human weakness that led to the birth of the Moabite nation. Today, we'll explore not just their origins, but how the Moabites became entangled with Israel, at times seducing them into idolatry, and at other times posing as fierce enemies. Their story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of straying from God's commandments and the consequences of allowing sin to take root. But there's more to the Moabites than just being adversaries. They were also a people used by God to fulfill his divine plan in ways that many might find surprising. So, sit back, hit that like button, and prepare to dive deep into one of the Bible's most dramatic and impactful stories. This is not just about the rise and fall of a nation. It's about understanding how God's sovereignty weaves through even the most flawed of human histories to bring about his purposes. In the vast expanse of biblical history, few events are as dramatic and fearsome as the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities stood as symbols of prosperity, wealth, and earthly pleasure. Located in the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley, they appeared to be thriving, offering an almost paradisiacal lifestyle to those who lived within their walls. Yet, beneath this facade of abundance lay a darkness that would ultimately lead to their downfall. The Bible is clear about the level of corruption that had taken hold of these cities. Genesis 13:13 tells us, "But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly." The inhabitants were known for their pride, arrogance, and, most notoriously, their disregard for the sanctity of life and human dignity. This wasn't just a matter of a few individuals going astray. It was a widespread, systemic rot that infected the very core of these societies. Their actions were so abhorrent that they provoked God's wrath to a level rarely seen in the biblical narrative. Abraham, who was living nearby, was made aware of God's intentions to destroy these cities. He interceded fervently on their behalf, hoping that even a small remnant of righteous individuals might be found there, pleading with God to spare the cities if even 10 righteous people could be discovered. But as we know, there were not even 10 who walked in righteousness. And so, 2 angels were dispatched to carry out God's judgment. They arrived at Sodom, where they were met by Lot, Abraham's nephew, who recognized their divine nature and urgently invited them into his home, seeking to protect them from the dangers that prowled the streets. That night, however, the depravity of Sodom reached its climax as men from every part of the city surrounded Lot's house, demanding that he surrender the visitors to them. In a desperate attempt to protect his guests, Lot offered his own daughters instead, an act that speaks volumes about the depth of moral confusion and desperation in those times. But even this shocking offer did nothing to deter the mob. It was then that the angels intervened, striking the aggressors with blindness and commanding Lot to gather his family and flee the city before the impending judgment. As dawn approached, the angels urged Lot, his wife, and his daughters to escape to the mountains, instructing them to not look back. The devastation that followed was swift and complete. Genesis 19:24-25 tells us, "Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven, and he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. It was a scene of absolute desolation, a testament to God's righteous anger against sin, and a warning to all generations about the consequences of straying from his ways. But as they fled, Lot's wife, unable to resist the urge to look back, turned to witness the destruction and was instantly transformed into a pillar of salt. Her fate serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of clinging to the past, of hesitating when God commands us to move forward. With Sodom and Gomorrah reduced to ashes, Lot and his daughters found refuge in a cave in the mountains. And it's here, in this place of isolation and despair, that the story takes a shocking turn, setting the stage for the birth of the Moabites. After escaping the flames that consumed Sodom and Gomorrah, Lot and his two daughters found themselves in a cave, high up in the mountains, isolated and facing an uncertain future. This wasn't just a physical isolation, it was emotional and spiritual. They had witnessed the obliteration of everything they knew. Every sign of civilization they had ever known was gone, wiped out in an instant by the hand of God. It's hard to imagine the sheer trauma they must have felt. Their hearts were heavy with fear, uncertainty, and the weight of their recent past. In this cave, the daughters of Lot believed they were the last survivors of humanity, the only ones left in a world reduced to ashes. They were overwhelmed by a sense of despair, hopelessness, and a pressing fear that their family line, their very existence, was about to be erased from history. You have to understand, in the ancient world, lineage and family heritage were everything. To be without descendants was to be forgotten, erased, as if you had never existed at all. This fear drove them to consider a plan that would seem unthinkable to most, yet to them, it was a desperate attempt to cling to a future. In their desperation, the daughters devised a plan that would ensure the continuation of their family line. They decided to take turns intoxicating their father with wine, so much so that he would be unaware of what was happening, and then lie with him to conceive children. The sheer gravity of this decision is something that leaves many of us speechless. It's easy to judge their actions from our perspective today, but we must try to grasp the hopelessness and fear that fueled such a drastic course of action. For these young women, isolated in that cave, the destruction of their world felt final and absolute. They believed this was the only way to preserve their lineage, the only way to ensure that their father's legacy would not disappear into the void. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat what happened. It tells us in Genesis 19:33-35 that on the first night, the older daughter made her father drink wine until he was heavily intoxicated. Then, she lay with him while he was unaware of her presence. The next night, the younger daughter did the same, repeating the process to secure the continuation of their family. As a result of these actions, both daughters conceived and gave birth to sons. The elder daughter named her child Moab, meaning from the father, while the younger named her son Ben-Ami, meaning son of my people. These two children would go on to become the ancestors of the Moabites and Ammonites, respectively, nations that would play significant roles in the history of Israel. This part of the story is unsettling, even disturbing. It confronts us with the reality that, sometimes, people make unimaginable choices when they feel there is no other option. But this act of desperation would have far-reaching consequences, both for the descendants of Lot and for the history of the people of Israel. It set the stage for a long and tumultuous relationship between the Moabites, the Ammonites, and the Israelites, one that would be marked by conflict, rivalry, and moments of unexpected grace. As we consider this dark and complex chapter, we are reminded that God often works through the most flawed and desperate situations to fulfill His greater purposes. The actions of Lot's daughters were undeniably born out of fear and a misguided sense of duty, but their story doesn't end there. In fact, it's just the beginning of an incredible journey for their descendants, one that would impact the course of biblical history in ways no one could have foreseen. As the years went by, the descendants of Lot's daughters grew into a formidable nation, the Moabites. Positioned east of the Jordan River, in present-day Jordan, the Moabites developed their own culture, traditions, and beliefs. They became a prosperous and established nation, but their relationship with Israel was fraught with tension, conflict, and moments of uneasy alliance. From the very beginning, the Moabites were viewed with suspicion and caution by the Israelites, as their origins were rooted in an act that went against the very fabric of moral and cultural norms. The first significant interaction between Israel and Moab occurred during the Israelites' journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. As the Israelites approached the plains of Moab, their sheer numbers and reputation as God's chosen people instilled fear in Balak, the king of Moab. He saw this mass of people and felt threatened, worried that Israel would overrun his land and leave his nation in ruins. Instead of seeking peace or understanding, Balak took a path that would forever mark Moab's relationship with Israel. He sought to curse them. To accomplish this, Balak hired Balaam, a well-known prophet, to pronounce curses upon the Israelites. The story is both fascinating and ironic. Here we have the king of Moab, desperate to stop the advance of God's people, attempting to use a divine curse against them. But God intervened. Every time Balaam tried to speak curses over Israel, only blessings came forth. In Numbers 24, 5-9, we see one of the most beautiful and profound blessings Balaam spoke over Israel. How beautiful are your tents, O Jacob, your dwelling places, O Israel. Despite Balak's desperate attempts, he couldn't thwart God's plan for his people. The encounter ended with a frustrated and defeated Balak sending Balaam away, but this would not be the last time the Moabites tried to undermine Israel. While Balaam couldn't curse Israel directly, he did offer Balak a piece of advice that would lead to one of the most damaging events in Israel's history. He suggested that if Israel could not be cursed, they could be seduced. And so Moabite women were sent into the Israelite camp to tempt the men, leading them into acts of idolatry and immorality. This strategy worked. The men of Israel fell into temptation, participating in pagan rituals and worshiping the false god Baal of Peor. This act of disobedience kindled God's wrath, resulting in a deadly plague that swept through the Israelite camp, killing 24,000 people. It was a devastating lesson about the dangers of compromising one's faith and the consequences of allowing temptation to take root. This episode defined the Moabite-Israelite relationship for generations. The Moabites became synonymous with temptation, idolatry, and a direct threat to Israel's spiritual purity. Yet, despite the animosity and the history of conflict, there were moments of connection between the two nations. One of the most profound examples is the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman who chose to follow the God of Israel and became an integral part of Israel's story, even entering the lineage of King David and ultimately Jesus Christ. It's this complex relationship, marked by both hostility and redemption, that makes the story of the Moabites and their interaction with Israel so compelling. It serves as a reminder that, even in the midst of conflict and strife, God's grace can find a way to turn enemies into family and outcasts into key players in His divine plan. This tension, this push and pull between the Moabites and Israel, would continue for many years, shaping the destiny of both nations in ways that are still felt in the pages of biblical history. The Moabites were a complex and deeply religious people, and their faith was central to their identity. At the heart of Moabite worship was the god Chemosh, who was seen as a powerful, albeit often brutal, deity. Unlike the God of Israel, who emphasized justice, mercy, and righteousness, Chemosh demanded strict loyalty, and his worship involved practices that were both disturbing and harsh by today's standards. Chemosh was considered the national god of the Moabites, and his influence permeated every aspect of their society, from political decisions to everyday life. One of the most notable characteristics of Moabite religion was their use of human sacrifice. It's a chilling aspect of their worship that starkly contrasts with the teachings of the God of Israel. In moments of desperation, Moabite kings and leaders would resort to sacrificing their own children to appease Chemosh and secure victory in battle or deliverance from a crisis. A clear example of this can be found in 2 Kings 3:26-27, where King Mesha of Moab, facing imminent defeat against Israel, sacrificed his firstborn son on the city wall as an offering to Chemosh. This act was meant to invoke the favor of their god in a moment of desperation, and it reveals just how far the Moabites were willing to go to secure what they believed to be divine intervention. The Moabites' dedication to Chemosh wasn't limited to acts of sacrifice. Their religious practices also included temple prostitution and various fertility rites. These rituals were believed to ensure the land's prosperity, abundant harvests, and the continued favor of their deity. It's important to understand that, in the ancient world, religion and daily life were deeply intertwined. For the Moabites, participating in these rites wasn't just a spiritual act. It was seen as a necessary means of securing the well-being of their families, crops, and livestock. But it wasn't just their religious practices that set the Moabites apart. Their culture, while rich and vibrant, often stood in stark contrast to the values held by the Israelites. Moabite society was structured around a monarchy, with the king serving as both a political leader and a religious figure. This dual role gave the king immense power and influence, as he was considered the representative of Chemosh on earth. This position of authority allowed Moabite kings to dictate not only political affairs, but also religious practices, reinforcing the worship of Chemosh as the foundation of Moabite life. Additionally, the Moabites were known for their craftsmanship and trade, thriving in the region east of the Dead Sea. Their land was fertile, allowing them to cultivate crops and raise livestock, which they traded with neighboring nations. This prosperity gave the Moabites a sense of pride and independence, further fueling their sense of identity as a unique and formidable people. However, this sense of pride would often lead them into direct conflict with Israel, especially when their religious practices began to influence and corrupt the Israelites, drawing them away from their covenant with God. The story of the Moabites' religion and culture offers a stark reminder of the dangers of straying from God's path and the seductive pull of foreign influences. While they were a people with their own traditions, beliefs, and strengths, their rejection of God and devotion to Chemosh ultimately became their downfall. As we explore more of their interactions with Israel, it becomes clear that the spiritual battle between the God of Israel and the gods of the surrounding nations was not just a historical event, but a timeless lesson on the consequences of turning away from the truth. If you're seeking a breakthrough in your life, whether it's physical healing, emotional restoration, or a deeper connection with God, there's something you need to know. I have something powerful for you. The miracle of the 7-day healing. This is more than just a guide. It's a transformative journey that shows you the steps a true believer should take to strengthen their relationship with God. It's rooted in biblical principles and can help you unlock the miraculous power of God in your life. You can access this life-changing guide right now by clicking the link in the pinned comment below. The relationship between the Moabites and the Israelites took a dark and troubling turn in one of the most scandalous episodes recorded in the Bible. The Moabites, fully aware of the Israelites' vulnerabilities, launched a scheme that would lead many away from their devotion to God. In Numbers 25, we see this plan unfold. As the Israelites camped at Shittim, the Moabite women began to entice them, drawing them into acts of immorality and idolatry. These weren't just casual encounters. They were deliberate attempts to lure the Israelites into worshiping false gods, specifically Baal of Peor, a deity associated with fertility and perverse rituals. This event was more than just a story of temptation. It was a calculated spiritual attack aimed at weakening the Israelites from within. The Moabite women, through their seduction, convinced many Israelite men to participate in pagan rituals, where acts of immorality were central. This was an abomination to the Lord, who had clearly commanded his people to stay pure and separate from the practices of the surrounding nations. What's even more shocking is how easily the Israelites, who had seen the power of God firsthand through the miracles in Egypt and their journey through the wilderness, fell into this trap. The impact of this seduction was devastating. God's anger was kindled against Israel, and a deadly plague broke out among the people. In total, 24,000 Israelites lost their lives due to this act of rebellion and unfaithfulness. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a stark reminder of how easily God's people could be led astray when they allowed themselves to be influenced by foreign practices. The Moabites' success in this scheme demonstrated not only their cunning but also the vulnerability that Israel faced when they strayed from God's commands. However, amid this crisis, one man stood up in righteous anger: Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron. When he witnessed an Israelite man openly bringing a Moabite woman into the camp, he took a spear and put an end to their sinful act, piercing both of them. This act of zeal stopped the plague, and God commended Phinehas for his unwavering commitment to righteousness, establishing a covenant of peace with him. This story serves as a powerful reminder of how seductive influences can corrupt even the chosen people of God, and it highlights the importance of standing firm in faith, no matter the temptations that surround us. In the midst of the Israelites' journey through the wilderness, their increasing numbers and strength struck fear into the hearts of their neighboring nations. One such nation was Moab, whose king, Balak, realized that he could not defeat Israel through military might alone. Desperate and fearful, Balak sought a more cunning and spiritual method to weaken the Israelites. This led him to the mysterious prophet Balaam, a man known for his supernatural ability to bless or curse. Balak sent messengers to Balaam with a clear request: "Come and curse Israel." The king hoped that a curse from this prophet would turn the tide in his favor. Interestingly, when Balaam sought God's guidance, the Lord explicitly told him not to curse the Israelites, for they were a blessed people. Despite this divine warning, Balaam's heart wavered because Balak's offers of wealth and honor were enticing. It's important to note that while Balaam claimed to be a prophet who would only speak what God instructed, his heart was divided, torn between obedience to God and the desire for worldly gain. As Balaam journeyed to meet Balak, God sent an angel to confront him, blocking his path. What makes this moment even more remarkable is that Balaam's donkey saw the angel standing with a drawn sword, but Balaam himself did not. In frustration, Balaam struck his donkey 3 times, and in an extraordinary turn of events, God opened the donkey's mouth, allowing it to speak. "Why have you beaten me these 3 times?" the donkey asked. Only then did Balaam's eyes open to the reality of the angel standing before him. This moment revealed Balaam's blindness, not just physically but spiritually as well. Despite these warnings, Balaam continued on his journey, and when he finally stood before Balak, ready to utter the curse, something miraculous happened. Instead of curses, blessings flowed from his mouth. 3 times Balaam attempted to curse Israel, and each time God transformed his words into blessings. One of the most profound blessings is recorded in Numbers 24, 5-6. "How beautiful are your tents, Jacob, your dwelling places, Israel. Like valleys they spread out, like gardens beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, like cedars beside the waters." This episode reveals that no force of darkness can undo the plans and blessings that God has set for his people. Even when the enemy sought to harm Israel through deception and sorcery, God turned it around, demonstrating his absolute sovereignty. Balak's plans were completely thwarted, and Balaam, despite his desire for personal gain, became an instrument of God's purpose. This moment serves as a powerful reminder that God's promises cannot be altered, no matter how much the enemy tries to interfere, and that his blessings are irrevocable. One of the most extraordinary twists in the narrative of the Moabites is found in the story of Ruth, a tale of love, loyalty, and redemption that stands in stark contrast to the darker elements of Moab's history. Ruth was a Moabite woman who married into an Israelite family that had moved to Moab during a time of famine. Her story begins with tragedy. Her Israelite husband, along with his brother and father, all died, leaving Ruth, her sister-in-law Orpah, and her mother-in-law Naomi in a dire situation. Naomi, grief-stricken and without hope, decided to return to Bethlehem, her homeland, having heard that the Lord had ended the famine there. She urged her daughters-in-law to stay in Moab and find new husbands. While Orpah reluctantly stayed behind, Ruth made a life-changing decision that would not only alter her destiny, but also impact the future of all humanity. In a moment of profound loyalty, Ruth declared, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." Ruth 1:16. This declaration wasn't just an expression of loyalty. It was a commitment to forsake her Moabite roots and embrace the God of Israel, Yahweh. Arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth and Naomi were impoverished, with little means to survive. Ruth took on the humble task of gleaning in the fields during the barley harvest to provide for both herself and her mother-in-law. It was during this laborious work that she caught the eye of Boaz, a wealthy landowner who was also a relative of Naomi. The Bible describes Boaz as a man of great kindness and integrity, and he soon became deeply moved by Ruth's dedication to Naomi and her willingness to work hard, despite the societal stigma of being a foreigner in Israel. Boaz extended extraordinary kindness to Ruth, ensuring her safety and allowing her to gather extra grain. Naomi, recognizing that Boaz was a potential kinsman redeemer, a relative who could redeem them from their desperate situation, instructed Ruth to approach Boaz in a way that demonstrated her willingness to be under his care and protection. Following Naomi's guidance, Ruth humbly laid herself at Boaz's feet one night as a sign of her request for redemption and protection. Rather than seeing this as inappropriate, Boaz saw Ruth's actions as honorable and agreed to take on the role of her redeemer. Through a series of divinely orchestrated events, Boaz married Ruth, and their union resulted in the birth of a son named Obed. Obed would become the grandfather of King David, making Ruth, a Moabite woman, a great-grandmother to the most celebrated king in Israel's history, and eventually an ancestor of Jesus Christ himself. This incredible inclusion of Ruth in the genealogy of Jesus, as outlined in Matthew 1, demonstrates God's grace and the way he often works through the most unlikely people to fulfill his divine plans. The story of Ruth reminds us that no matter our background, ethnicity, or past, God's love and redemptive power have the ability to transform lives and change destinies. From being a woman of a nation known for seducing Israel into sin, Ruth was brought into God's covenant family, becoming a key figure in his plan of salvation. This shows that God's grace reaches beyond any barriers, embracing those who earnestly seek him, and proving that even the most unexpected individuals can play an essential role in the unfolding of his divine purpose. As we journey further into the history of the Moabites, we come to one of the most significant and sobering aspects of their story: the prophecies and judgment pronounced against them by God. Throughout the Bible, the Moabites were not only depicted as enemies of Israel, but also as a people who continually turned to idolatry, pride, and rebellion against God. This waywardness ultimately led to a series of prophetic warnings and judgments that would shape the destiny of Moab. The prophet Isaiah, one of the foremost voices in the Old Testament, delivered a powerful message of judgment against Moab in Isaiah 15 and 16. In vivid detail, Isaiah describes the impending destruction that would fall upon Moab. The cities of Ar and Kir, which were once bustling with life and prosperity, would be laid waste, and the once fertile land of Moab would be reduced to a barren wilderness. Isaiah's words painted a haunting picture of the Moabites fleeing in terror, their cries echoing throughout the land, as their fields and vineyards, the sources of their wealth, were destroyed. This prophecy revealed that the pride and arrogance of Moab had reached a tipping point, and God's judgment was now inevitable. He declared, "We have heard of the pride of Moab, how proud he is, of his arrogance, his pride, and his insolence, but his boasts are empty." Isaiah 16:6. It was their arrogance and refusal to turn to God that sealed their fate. Jeremiah, another great prophet, also spoke extensively about the judgment that would fall upon Moab. In Jeremiah 48, the prophet's words are filled with sorrow and lament as he foresees the downfall of this once powerful nation. He warns that Moab would be shattered, her cities destroyed, and her people taken into captivity. The chapter describes how Moab had become complacent, living comfortably in their wealth and security, but they had forgotten the Lord. In verses 11 to 12, Jeremiah states, "Moab has been at ease from his youth, settled like wine on its dregs, not poured from jar to jar. So he has remained, and his flavor is intact, and his aroma is unspoiled. But the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will send men who pour from jars, and they will pour him out. They will empty his jars and smash his jugs." This metaphor of wine left undisturbed, becoming stagnant and spoiled, perfectly captures the spiritual state of Moab. They had grown comfortable in their rebellion and refused to change, leading to the inevitable pouring out of God's judgment upon them. The prophecies against Moab served as both a warning and a reminder that God is not only a God of love and mercy, but also a God of justice and righteousness. He does not ignore sin, arrogance, or idolatry, and eventually, there comes a time when judgment must be executed. The downfall of Moab, as foretold by Isaiah and Jeremiah, came to pass when the Babylonians invaded and devastated the land, leaving it in ruins, just as the prophets had declared. This fulfilled prophecy stands as a testament to God's sovereignty and his power to bring about his will. Yet, even in the midst of judgment, there was a glimmer of hope. In the closing verse of Jeremiah 48, God promises, Yet I will restore the fortunes of Moab in the latter days, declares the Lord. Jeremiah 48:47. This shows that God's ultimate plan is one of redemption, even for those who have wandered far from Him. It serves as a reminder that no matter how far one might stray, God's mercy remains available for those who genuinely seek repentance and a return to His ways. This prophetic insight into Moab's story is not just a lesson for an ancient nation, but a timeless reminder of the consequences of pride, rebellion, and the incredible grace that God extends to all who turn back to Him. As we reflect on the story of the Moabites, it's clear that their journey holds profound lessons that resonate even in our modern world. Their rise, rebellion, and eventual downfall offer timeless insights about human nature, pride, and the consequences of turning away from God. One of the most significant lessons we can learn from the Moabites is the danger of allowing pride and self-reliance to take the place of humility and dependence on God. In their time of prosperity, the Moabites grew arrogant and believed that their wealth and power were sufficient to sustain them. They forgot that everything they had was given by God, and in doing so, they set themselves up for a devastating fall. We see this same temptation today. In a world that often glorifies self-sufficiency and independence, it's easy to forget our need for God. We can become so wrapped up in our achievements, possessions, and status that we start to believe we don't need divine guidance. But just as the Moabites learned, pride always precedes destruction. The Bible reminds us in Proverbs 16:18, "Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall." This is not just a lesson for nations, but for individuals. We must constantly check our hearts and ensure that we remain humble, recognizing that all we have and all we are comes from God. The moment we begin to trust in ourselves more than in Him, we risk following the same path as Moab. Another powerful lesson from the Moabite story is the impact of idolatry and how it can lead to devastating consequences. The Moabites' worship of false gods, such as Chemosh, pulled them further away from the truth and brought God's judgment upon them. Idolatry in our lives may not always be as obvious as bowing to statues or performing rituals, but it can take many subtle forms. Whether it's an obsession with money, power, relationships, or even our careers, anything that takes the place of God in our hearts is an idol. The story of the Moabites challenges us to examine our lives and identify the things we may be placing above God. Are we devoting more time and energy to our ambitions than to our relationship with Him? Are we allowing distractions to become more important than our faith? The call to turn away from idolatry and back to God is as relevant now as it was for the Moabites. Additionally, the story of Ruth, a Moabite woman who chose to follow the God of Israel, teaches us about redemption, grace, and the transformative power of God's love. Despite her background and the stigma associated with being a Moabite, Ruth's faithfulness and decision to commit to God led her into His redemptive plan. She became part of the lineage of King David, and ultimately, the lineage of Jesus Christ. This demonstrates that no matter where we come from or what mistakes we've made, God can use us for His greater purpose if we turn to Him with a sincere heart. It's a reminder that our past does not have to define our future. With God, there is always the possibility of a new beginning. The final lesson from the Moabite story is about God's justice and mercy. While God's judgment fell upon the Moabites for their rebellion and sin, He also extended a promise of restoration in Jeremiah 48:47. This promise reveals that God's heart is not to destroy, but to redeem. Even in the midst of judgment, His desire is for us to repent, turn back to Him, and be restored. In our lives today, no matter how far we've strayed, God's mercy is still available. He's waiting with open arms, ready to forgive and restore those who earnestly seek Him. This powerful truth reminds us that God's love is steadfast, and His desire is always to bring us back into a relationship with Him. As we reach the end of this incredible journey through the history of the Moabites, we're left with profound lessons about faith, obedience, and God's unwavering justice. It's a story that reminds us of the dangers of pride, idolatry, and turning away from the path that God has set before us. But it also offers hope, showing us that no matter how far we may stray, there's always a chance for redemption and a way back to God's grace. The story of the Moabites is a mirror for us today, calling us to examine our own lives, our choices, and our relationship with God. And speaking of strengthening your relationship with God, if you want to experience His miraculous power in your life, I highly recommend The Miracle of the 7-Day Healing. It's an incredible guide to revelation and breakthrough in your life. The link is pinned in the top comment, so make sure you check it out. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button, and share this video with others who need to hear this powerful story. And if you're looking for more biblical insights, click on the next video that's appearing on your screen now. It's another incredible journey through God's Word that you won't want to miss. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.